Chair of INGSA. INGSA is the International Network for Government Science Advice, and the next meeting of INGSA will be in Montreal in September. So we'll come back to that in a minute. So here at the meeting, I act as a moderator for a session on cities, urban advice in emergency situation, focusing on climate change. Why city? Why should we be concerned about science advice to cities? Well, certainly if we take the Sustainable Development Goal as an example, of course at very, very high level, global, United Nations, and of course country are involved, but at the end of the day, for many of the objective of the SDGs, citizens, cities must be involved if we want to have traction and reach the goal of the SDGs. So critically important to involve cities, but of course there is less of a tradition in terms of scientists giving advice to cities. Yes, here and there, but less of a way of doing that. We are lucky today. We have experts that are doing that on almost a daily basis. So they will summarize some of the discussion we had yesterday, and then we'll have a few questions. So the first speaker will be Amy Lurs. Amy is the Executive Director of Future Earth, and she will summarize her presentation at the conference yesterday.
Great, thank you. So we had a great discussion yesterday from lots of different perspectives, thinking about the role of cities in climate, in addressing the climate crisis, especially from the context of a resilience perspective. Lots of different viewpoints on this issue, which is obviously very complex. I think the issues that I brought to the table in discussion that I think were critical to think about when we explore the role of cities. One is just recognizing that as we move forward on this global challenge, how important non-state actors are to addressing a global issue. And so cities' role in addressing this is not just managing climate risks internally, but I think increasingly has to be thinking about building resilience at a global scale, and science has a role to play to how we can make that shift and empower cities to be even more effective within a broader sort of polycentric governance system. In that context, one of the things that I focused on was really thinking about understanding science within the context of the uniqueness of place of different cities, so that the science that's needed and the actions that need to be taken to build resilience have to be are and oftentimes sort of unique or characteristic of that place. And how to do that and support those cities in that sort of uniqueness or context is a challenge, but one that we have to face. But the other piece was connections. That the cities, there's connections within a city that's really critical to resilience, but that connections among cities is also really important as we look to build resilience in a complex world. And finally, I highlighted the importance of metrics. Metrics in defining resilience haven't really been operational. We have a lot of different versions of this from a very micro scale, at very sectoral scale. We know a lot from a lot of research on ecological systems, social ecological systems, on what characterizes and what determines resilience, but haven't really figured out an operational approach to support resilience funding and unlock the capital that could come along with it. And that is particularly important as we think about the collective resilience in the context of the global stocktake that will be taken unfolding as part of the UN climate negotiations process.
Well, thank you very much, Amy. The next speaker, Clara Washburn from University College of London, and Clara is also on the working group at INGSA on urban advice. So, Clara.
Thank you very much. Yes, I think Amy's done a really good job already of summarizing the gist of the session and the main points of discussion. Just briefly, the areas that I was focusing on within the session were understanding how cities know themselves better, essentially the sorts of structures that we put in place to gather data about cities, to turn that into useful knowledge and insights, and then to be able to take action on those insights at city level. Obviously, this is important at any point in time. It's incredibly useful to know what your city is doing right now, to be able to respond to changes, to be able to respond to things happening over the long term, but things that happen in the short term as well. So the sense of, I think, as Amy again has already set out, nuance between cities, so respecting that cities are different, but being able to understand whether there are common things that these sorts of institutions can do, common shapes that they can take, common ways in which that they might operate, is very interesting to look into. So this was the work that I was speaking about, was focusing particularly on institutions called urban observatories, which set out to do this work. There are many hundreds of them in cities all over the world. And part of our research at University College London, in collaboration with the Harting City Region Observatory and with the University of Melbourne, has been trying to understand the shape of these institutions better.
Well, thank you very much, Clara. And we had the third speaker as well in the session, Jordelina Ardoy, from an international institute on environmental issues and development, sustainable development from Argentina. And Jorgelina focused on the mid-sized cities and the challenge in mid-sized cities compared to maybe larger cities. There is a lot of challenge in large city, but often the mid-sized one have even less resources than larger cities. So she spoke about the challenge of mid-sized cities. One of them, of course, being long-term support for these type of activity as related to the impact of climate change on the city, but also on health of citizen. So maybe a couple of follow-up question for both of you. Is there a gold standard in the world saying in terms of cities, this should be a model that other cities worldwide could try to emulate, adapt to the local situation, of course, but could try to emulate? In your mind, is there a city in the world in relation to climate change, but also broader than climate change, that we should try to emulate? Clara.
I feel like I'm going to dodge the question, and I apologize in advance for doing that. But I feel that there's not, because it is so context dependent. So I think there are cities which are doing things that are good for them, and that's perhaps useful to remark on. So there are cities making decisions, putting infrastructures in place that suit them as a city, and I think that is the most important element. But I think to sort of to pick one city out, I'm a little bit nervous around. I know that there is a lot of work and there are many trends actually towards sort of benchmarking cities and ranking them and understanding them against one another in that sense. It makes me a little bit nervous in this context, I think, because ultimately a lot of the work that we do is actually understanding the vision that the cities have for themselves. And you know, some of these will have common themes, some of these things will be shared, but actually each city maybe wants something slightly different for its own context. So I completely dodged the question, as I said I was going to.
So, Amy.
I think I'm just going to say yes, what you said.
If you don't want to answer this one, maybe put that in the context of, and you mentioned that, I think both of you to some extent, network. So is the better way to do it, instead of trying to maybe imitate one, is to try to be part of a global network of cities that can learn from each other.
Yes, no, absolutely, I think so. And it's something which we are also looking at within our research. It's something which we've engaged with a number of specific networks, actually. So as part of my job at UCL, I look after our Master Public Administration program. And a big part of that program is actually engaging students with partners working in this space, working in city challenges. So we have been looking at, say, examples within C40 cities, exactly around these sorts of questions you're asking, like, is it beneficial to be part of this? Can we learn things from other cities within these networks? How, in which ways, on what sorts of topics? So, no, absolutely. I think it's useful and enabling to be part of a bigger network, whether that be, as I know I've mentioned C40, but whether that be something more grassroots and informal or something very kind of visible and formalized. It's having that space to I suppose, understand and share challenges, and actually to know that challenges perhaps exist for you that you maybe wouldn't have identified um, had you not been having that broader conversation with other cities, and to identify solutions that you may just not have been aware of. Yeah, absolutely.
So, absolutely, and there are so many networks, as you mentioned already, in cities where people are learning from each other. And I guess the one area that I would add to that, though, is not just what I think we could probably do more of is not just learn from each other about what to do in the cities, but actually how to more effectively work together to solve the problems across the cities. Because these cities, of course, in the context of our complex world, are not independent anymore. Both from we're seeing that with coronavirus, right? I mean, there are connections and flows, and actually, the the world of the infectious disease communities have really networks that are informal networks that share data and address and have managed to focus on addressing these sorts of things in a way that our broader sustainability community can probably learn from.
And if we come back to the challenge of climate change and maybe migration that could be related to that in the future, what's your take on that one in terms of science and scientists talking to cities?
So in terms of there is a huge role, of course, for the scientific community in this space, because especially in the context of resilience, I often say, mitigation's easy and resilience is really hard. And a lot of that has to do with science, not just the biophysical science of understanding what the changes are, but the social science in terms of understanding how how the social ecological systems respond and change accordingly, and how to help them do that. One of the things in that context that I want to highlight, this isn't dodging the question, but I think is important in this piece is, the importance of data in the context of managing these is huge. And I would say that our information, our database is getting better, and I'm sure that Carla has more to say about that. But the one thing I would highlight that there is a large gap is that we don't necessarily have the best data on the most vulnerable regions or the biggest priority areas. And I was thinking back on Bill Gates' talk yesterday about the health components, and there's a real parallel in the context of data and information in the context of climate and resilience issues. And that's something that is something we have to collectively address, because we know how to deal with that information. We know how to sort of respond to that increasingly, and even support the development of businesses in the same way in the health sector. But because there isn't that basis, because there's not a motivation to get those data, then there's a skewing and we're leaving some people behind. And I think that's a really key issue in the role of science in private.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I think this is really critical. Like, what data do we actually need? Like, what are we looking for? And where that is incredibly variable. I think one of the points that I tend to make is actually it's been really interesting to look at climate change as a sort of unifying factor across global cities. And I say global cities just as cities around the world, not global cities, as in specific cities. I think the sort of deeper challenge for me perhaps comes to the fact that we need to talk about climate change, we need to talk about resilience, but actually when we're talking about that, we're talking about a number of other things in and around this space, around how we use land, how we look after our ecosystems, how we look after our biodiversity, how we manage our water. So I suppose Yeah, it's opening a very big box in terms of the sort of data we're then interested in, the sort of knowledge that we need to reflect on all of these possible systems that are actually completely interrelated within the Earth system that our cities are then within that sort of very physical context of. So, yeah, it's a fascinating question for cities, I think. And it has been a sort of unifying factor, but the diversity, the scope, the scale, the pace of the data that we need is, yeah, unprecedented.
And maybe get at the beginning, I talk a little bit about science and scientists and finding ways to ensure that scientists have closer link with cities, small and large. So any suggestion, advice? We have been working on that for quite many years. What's your take on that and how to improve on that front over the next decade?
I think there are a number of different ways. So I suppose reflecting on how I got involved in working in cities, I was working in them as just a space. I trained in earth sciences and I was working on urban geoscience issues. But as I started to engage much more with policy and with decision making, I was actually sometimes doing that at quite a grassroots level. So I was contributing to, I'm based in London, so I was contributing to responses to various pieces of policy that were being decided within the London context, which you could actually do as a citizen within the city. But yes, I think in terms of engaging with cities as scientists, part of it is just knowing that there's the opportunity there. Previously, I worked in the Parliament in the UK and actually regularly had questions from researchers, from scientists, as to how they could get involved in legislative decision making. I mean, that's an interesting question because we're all aware that legislative decision making is a thing. It's there, it has particular structures, it's working in certain ways, but it's still quite unclear as to how you can engage with that sometimes. I think in the urban space, there's perhaps an additional lack of clarity as to where you engage as a scientist. So I think actually increasing the visibility of the need for it is useful, just in making it visible that it's something that you can and may want to contribute to. But I think there's probably still the space of, setting out that space of how and what, yeah.
I guess one thought I would have on this is, you phrase the question in terms of scientist, which I think is really important, versus science, right? And so there's one piece of saying, where do you need science to inform various different decisions? But I think that the piece that is really important in terms of the scientist is having science at the table, even when you don't know you need to go get science advice. And I think that is something that, when you have, I'm sure it's a role that you play in Quebec. I know it certainly is a role that John Holdren played in the Obama administration. And when I spent some time at Google, and one time, during that time, I know that the sort of narrative there was you need tech at the table, and I would say, well, you need tech and science at the table, and those together, and they don't replace one another. And so the question is, at the city level, can you have science at the table without having someone who's really a science officer or chief scientist for the city? I don't know. I don't think you can invite them in when you think you need them and really have science at the table. So I'm not sure how to get around that, because I'm not sure every city in the world can afford to have a scientist, but it is something to think about.
Yeah, an interesting point as well to think about maybe at least making sure that the younger generation is aware that there may be opportunity on these front, that maybe for us as a funding organization to try to set up program that will promote that in a sense, so that you have science and scientists at the table a bit more frequently. So if you have anything to add on that, Clara?
Only to agree, I think. Yeah, it's one of those things. It's one of the reasons actually for us looking at this sort of organizational, institutional space and trying to understand how these systems of knowledge and advice can work together. That actually, what are those spaces and who are these people, and what sorts of things might you want to put in place to be able to get those structures working.
And any last minute comments from you?
I think just just to say that, I found the discussion we had really interesting because there are so many different perspectives, and the real need for those kind of conversations to be had to see how, from a governance standpoint, from a very local standpoint, from an international standpoint, how we can work together to empower cities to be the leaders that they really need to be if we're going to address this global problem.
I think my takeaway is actually from a conversation that I had just after the session yesterday, where one of the audience approached and said, essentially to paraphrase, but these are huge issues, and you people, it's so brave actually to be working on these big issues. I was like, yeah, I hadn't really thought about it in that way, but I'm very glad that we are, and I'm very glad that many people are, and these are huge questions, but they're ones that I know lots and lots of great people are now really kind of chipping away to address. So I thought that was an excellent observation. But yeah, it's a complex space, but there is so much good work happening in it. I think that's my takeaway.
Thank you very much, both of you, and we'll continue the discussion over the next few months, and we'll all invite you to Montreal INCSA 2020, September 15 to 17, and we'll discuss a lot about the role of cities and science advice to cities in the context of INCSA 2020. Thank you very much.